right, you curious, you courageous Herle Burlyites. Today's pod is a fantastic one, I think, because we're bringing together two people who mean a hell of a lot to me in both professional and personal sense. Started off as heroes, became mentors and colleagues, and now longtime friends. Elly, Alboim, and Bill Fox are here. We're going to dive into a topic that's become quite the political battleground over the last little while, the role and importance of CBC News. Both Elly and Bill are now two-time Herle Burly guests, an honorific I'm assuming will go right to the top of their CVs. But listen up to their actual bona fides. Elly was a journalist for the CBC for almost a quarter century, becoming Parliamentary Bureau Chief for TV News and National Political Editor. Today, he's an associate professor of journalism at Carleton and a principal at Earnscliffe Strategies. And he wrote a fantastic piece on today's topic called Eliminating the CBC, which you can check out at airquotesmedia.com. Bill began as a working journalist and became Ottawa and Washington bureau chief for the Toronto Star. Today, he's got about 18 academic degrees from small shops like Harvard and Carleton, and he's a leading analyst of media and communication. His latest book is Trump, Trudeau Tweets, Truth, A Conversation, which is a fantastic read. Please pick it up. All right, lots to cover here. How the news division is performing, the case for dismantling other legitimate journalistic alternatives, and maybe a little bit of China. Elly, Bill, really chuffed to have you here today. Thanks so much for doing this.
Great to be here, Dave.
So I want to talk to you about the CBC and news, but since we're talking the day after David Johnson's report, and he had some sharp words for some of the media coverage of the Chinese interference issue, I thought we'd talk about that for just a few minutes. Bill, what did you think of Johnson's comments about global news in particular?
A couple of things. First of all, I think that his decision to conduct the public hearings himself was shaped in no small measure by the media, and specifically by the media questioning of his personal integrity. And the impression I got watching him yesterday that he was cut to the quick, that it probably is the first experience in his life that he has ever had where his integrity has been questioned in such a public and accusatory way. And I think he decided, I'm going to defend myself, in effect. Right. I'm not handing this over to a judge. I'm going to do it. And I'm going to establish a record of fact. And people are, they can then come to their own conclusions. So that'd be point one. Point two, I didn't think that the government got off quite as unscathed as some of the media coverage would suggest. I think when you've been in power for 7 years and you have somebody in a first report saying, fundamentally, your machinery of government system has collapsed, I don't know how that's a good news story if you're the government of the day. And the third thing, I thought it was an interesting challenge for him to say, actually, you don't have to take my word for it. You are welcome to come and read everything I read. And if you don't like what you see, you can say so. And if you think I come to the wrong conclusion, you can say so. And you can do that without getting into the specifics of, the kind of what a particular line item says. I thought he would have served himself better had he not characterized some of the shortcomings of the media. I think if he'd have just stuck to a factual, the evidence does not support this, he'd have been better off because, I think it's always a mistake for people in his position to introduce an editorial process into the editorial process. He should have, to use the vernacular of newspapers, he should have stuck to the news pages and stayed off the opinion pages.
Elly, what do you think about his direct rebuttal to primarily global, not so much the globe, but a little bit the globe, but primarily global?
Well, he goes right at the core of the journalistic issue, right? And I don't know which side to pick in the dilemma. The assertion essentially is that global, and to a lesser extent the globe, saw only fragmentary bits and pieces. And reached conclusions based on those fragmentary bits and pieces. When he said he saw the entire record, including the transcript that Global had on the Hang Dong conversation. He says the conclusion was different. The Globe, the Global particularly, and the Globe somewhat, basically said, trust us. We've seen the documentation. We've reached the conclusion. Here's our news coverage of it. Johnson is saying, trust me, I've seen the record. The evidence doesn't hold up. It goes to, I guess, the fundamental problem of when journalists are forced to use anonymous sources and available material without having the full record of the full set of evidence, and they have to publish. And they publish in at a point in time, make an editorial judgment that what they have is enough to publish. But essentially, it's on a trust me basis. And Johnson has kind of called them and said, trust me, I don't think they reached the right conclusion. I don't know how to pick, frankly, and I don't think we'll ever see the documentation.
Well, did he do that, Bill, because Global's reporting was particularly egregious and needed to be addressed? Is there something they didn't do that a bureau should have done when given such information?
You know what? 2 points, I would say. The first is, I think there's been a lot of commentary in the media itself about Global's work, and I'm not going to pile on. But this is not a matter that has gone unaddressed in the media itself from the time those stories were first aired. The second thing is, there's a fundamental dilemma, and I think Elly makes a very important point. If you've had the good fortune to work on the inside in government, you'll often pick up a newspaper or turn on a television newscast, and you will see things, pieces of information positioned as contradictory. And I find that often when I listen to it, I think, actually, both of those things could be true.
Right.
To stick to the current China interference context, I think it's absolutely possible that those reports went in. And I think it's absolutely possible that those reports didn't get to a minister. I don't see those as contradictory things. And so, it goes to the need for context and the need for nuance that is kind of a challenge in a strict news context. Second point, another point I'd make is you go to the issue of sourcing. And I'm not second guessing any of the reporting, particularly the print reporting, because they're in a competitive, circumstance. You get some information that is not complete, but you've got something, and you have to get it into paper. Where the public struggles is they often don't give you very much context for the source. We don't know what the source's agenda is. And journalism has a tendency to heroize the whistleblower, and we always hear, the references to Watergate and all the rest of that. But in this current circumstance, one of the comments I make is, I doubt very much that Ben Bradley would have let Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein write those stories with a single source. I doubt that. And so, I think those are the kind of issues that are always a challenge. So where do I net out? I think you got to start from the premise that truth is cumulative, and that there is no one piece that is the absolute and final version of any event. And that it's therefore important that everybody keep working it and keep filing and keep building to the on the knowledge base, and that's ultimately where we get to get somewhere where we are more informed than we had been.
Elly, just to lift off from what Bill just said, what are we supposed to do with the fact that even if Johnson is correct and the journalists were wrong on the details of all of their stories, they were still kind of fundamentally right about the big story? Like in the sense that the Chinese are all over us and the government's not handling it well. This is now Johnson says this. And we wouldn't have known any of that if those stories hadn't been written.
Understood, but I'm not sure what you're asking.
So the stories themselves were inaccurate, but the aggregate effect of them was truth.
I guess, and assuming that is the right conclusion, I have no reason to argue against it. Particularly the internal flow of intelligence information seems particularly bizarre. But having said that, Johnson's done us a favor, I guess, highlighting it. I presume that his next round of public hearings, as he so calls them, speaking to experts and others, are going to talk about ways to fix that. But the fundamental political issue, I guess, is not being resolved. And look, we're only at Act 2 of probably a 3 or 4 act play here. The opposition parties will continue to bring pressure for a public inquiry. I don't know what the public mood is, but I think that there will be at least some puzzlement about why Johnson's word is definitive in this circumstance, given the general suspicion people have of government anyway, and of elites. So the thing isn't going away. The real question in my mind, I guess, is will the intelligence community and political community get to work and solve the problem? Because ultimately, this is a really significant issue. If foreign governments are trying to interfere with the way our country is run, we probably should do something about it. And, I don't think we need a judicial inquiry to do that. I think we need serious people to get to work and fix it.
Okay, enough.
I agree with that. I agree with that 100%. And I think when I say, my line of retreat being, truth is cumulative, Mr. Johnson's voice is a voice, not the voice. And therefore you have to create an opportunity for other voices, because what needs to happen is the problem needs to get fixed. We can't survive in a country and in a democracy and in a system, a parliamentary system of responsible government, if literally our defense is the memo didn't get to the minister's desk.
Right. No, I understand.
What do you mean by that?
They didn't have access to the security clearance.
I don't have access to a secure email and you're in charge of it. Like, really?
It actually just boggles the mind. Right?
It really does. It really does. All right, let's stick with
it into a black hole. Anyway.
For those of us who've never lived through one, I've got to believe when people hear wildfires, it conjures a broad image of immense blazes with a generalized sense of devastation. I guess what I'm saying is most of us have little conception of the thousands of ways, community by community, wildfires destroy infrastructure and turn lives upside down. Beyond the firefighting teams, it takes so many volunteers to help support and restore some sense of normalcy. What I'd like to do here is recognize team members and retirees from our presenting sponsor, TELUS, who are on the ground right now, helping communities ravaged by fires across Alberta in just about every way you can imagine. Herle Burlyites, here are just 2 examples among many. In Rainbow Lake, northwest of the province, the cell tower site lost its power, which meant absolutely no wireless service in Fort Nelson, BC, for key relief operations like the RCMP, CN Rail, and the hospital. Oh, and the single in and out road was closed because fire was on the doorstep. Alberta Wildlife Relief came through with a Puma Superlift chopper to fly in a huge trailer generator. TELUS technicians were also helicoptered in to connect the thing under some pretty dire circumstances, restoring service in Rainbow Lake and bringing Fort Nelson back online. Heading due south from there, over 800 people were evacuated from Sturgeon Lake Cree First Nation, many not having homes to return to because they were either gone or too badly burned. Darren Ketlow, TELUS's Indigenous Connectivity Relationship Lead, reached out immediately and with the help of a number of other TELUS team members, delivered on a long list of essential supplies. Trucks with food, water, disaster kits, diapers, and so much more were sent to the Grand Prairie Friendship Center, an evac site for Sturgeon Lake Cree and other Indigenous communities in the region. On top of that, they initiated a clothing drive to support the thousands displaced in surrounding communities. Large or small, it's these acts of kindness from people who care that make a difference. The TELUS team will continue to be there for as long as it takes. The reason I summoned you two gentlemen here today, because I'm worried about something. And I'm worried about the real possibility that CBC News will disappear. We have an election in a couple of years. The favorite to win has made ending funding to CBC English a signature promise, seems to mean it. And the reaction to me in the country feels muted about that. I worry that it could go under without much pushback. And what worries me is not that we won't have a CBC, although I don't like that either. What worries me is who else is doing what they are doing at the scale at which they are doing it. The CBC feels to me like the last vestige of well-funded, broad-based coverage. If it was defunded, would we lose the anchor of information in our country? Let's start with you, Elly, because you wrote the piece and you worked there. What's important about CBC News at this juncture in our history?
Well, if I can step sideways for a second, let me say that the journalistic ecosystem in this country is very fragile and being broken. The advent of the internet, the advent of regionalization, of decentralization, of polarization, has meant that we fragmented our national media. The business case is declining for our national media. Very few of them are making money, if any of them. And cumulatively, to borrow Bill's phrase, they collectively form a whole of national information that gets spread from coast to coast. They form a critical mass of journalists who, for good or for ill, spend their day covering government, covering public policy, covering public affairs, and connecting citizens to their country and their government. If you start to dislodge the largest organization in the country with the largest critical mass of journalists, there's going to be a loss, a very significant loss. There probably isn't any organization that can pick up what the CBC does. There's no doubt that you'll continue to have national newscasts once a night, on CTV and Global. But you won't have the reach and breadth that the CBC journalistic organization currently spans. Going back to your point about your fear about Poilievre and his plans, they're not clear. He seems to isolate on English television news as opposed to Radio Canada, Northern Service, Indigenous languages. They're all part of the CBC. It's not clear what he means by defunding the CBC. If in fact it means literally defunding the CBC, allowing Radio Canada to stand, but all the English side to disappear, the loss is going to be incalculable. Because for good or for ill, the CBC is still one of the strands that knits people together. But more to the point, it has more journalists in more outposts doing more journalism than many of the others combined. And I don't think the system can suffer the loss of that kind of organization.
Bill, you want to pick up from there? What are your thoughts about that?
So first of all, just to reinforce Elly's point about the fragility of the journalistic ecosystem, let me give you a very concrete illustration of how thin on the ground things are. When I was a member of the Parliamentary Press Gallery many moons ago, I had the good fortune to work for major organizations. But one of my colleagues at that time was the parliamentary correspondent for the London Free Press. They had their own person in Parliament. Mm-hmm. People had Queen's Park bureaus. People had City Hall bureaus. And I would have argued.
Regina Leader Post had an Ottawa correspondent.
For sure. As did the Calgary Herald, so all of that is gone. And so you've got this void, and it has to be, or it's in our collective interest that it be filled by somewhere. The CBC is a natural candidate for that. But the CBC, in my mind, doesn't understand its problem. The CBC thinks it's got a political problem. It doesn't. It has a political problem as a consequence of its real problem, which is it has a public problem. If you use news and current affairs for illustrative purposes, and if the National historically is the flagship of CBC News and Current Affairs, the flagship is taking on a lot of water. The audiences aren't just getting lower, they're literally disappearing like a snowbank in spring. And part of the reason for that is the CBC, I think, over time has become disconnected from the public it purports to serve and represent. And I think part of the reason for that is it has consistently seen its problem as political. And I don't think that's what it is. I mean, to go to Elly's point about Poilievre and Radio-Canada and the defunding of CBC English TV, why would you make an exception to Radio-Canada? Well, precisely because it is connected to its public, precisely because it does have audiences. And he's not going to mess around with that, right? So CBC English TV becomes the natural target. But I would argue that there's an element of self-inflicted wound to that.
Can I push you on something just a bit, Bill? I mean, my impression would be that nobody watches the CBC TV news anymore. I don't know anybody that watches it. But I think their digital presence is where their biggest impact is now in terms of the breadth of their news coverage. And is their digital coverage of the country not a kind of an underpinning or floor for all the coverage we have? To go to Elly's point about an ecosystem, isn't all that work that the CBC does just a baseline of information for us?
Well, a couple points. First of all, I agree with you about, I mean, when you first reached out to me and said, would you like to come on and talk about the CBC? I thought I should wave off for two reasons. One, like a lot of Canadians, I have a lot of connectors to the CBC. My wife, Bonnie, was an executive director of marketing and communications there. I think I cashed my first CBC check back in the late 60s, maybe early 70s. And I am an unsuccessful candidate for board chair. So, it's not like I don't have views about it.
It's truth or dare time now, Elly, apparently.
And the other reason was I thought, well, gee, I hardly watch the National anymore, so I don't like how current am I? And then I thought, well, I guess that's the point.
Right.
I do hardly watch the National, but I'm not alone. Like a lot of us who, I tend to watch their kind of evening news and current affairs programming, but make no mistake about it, those are village shows. We all pay a lot of attention to what goes on CBC Power and Politics. The broader public does not.
No. Unlike the Herle Burly, it is not a mass audience program.
That's correct. So the future is obviously digital, and that's as it should be. And I don't agree with the Globe and Mail that accuses the CBC of mission creep. I don't know how you could be in any business related to media and not be in digital space. But where I differ, perhaps, is I think that the government should use that migration to digital to change two fundamental things about the public broadcaster. The first is I think they should tell them to get out of the advertising business. And I think they should say, we will make up the difference. But I would get something for that. And my condition would be that you have to operate on the basis of an open license, that you maintain the copyright to your product, but it's got to be available to people across the country. And in if you made that change, then I think the CBC legitimately becomes, a kind of a national kind of support system for Canadian journalism writ large.
So every few years, big companies stage a comprehensive public reveal for the people who analyze and buy their stock. In attendance are a group of gimlet-eyed experts from financial institutions who dissect the presentations and write detailed reports that are taken very seriously indeed by investors worldwide. These analysts are effectively multi-billion-dollar influencers, and they are notoriously difficult people to impress. They're numbers wonks, indifferent to spin, consumed by metrics. Heaven help the CEO who tries to dress up mediocre performance with a rosy PowerPoint deck. Anyway, our sponsor CN just held its investors event, and the analysts responded with glowing reports, impressed by two things in particular: CN's intensely disciplined focus on customer service and its potential for growth in a patchy post-pandemic economy. I've talked here before about CN's absolute insistence that its trains depart and arrive on time. That's the plan, and the plan is sacred. But you have to keep filling trains with cargo. The economy is shifting, and businesses that don't seek new sources of business will be left behind. For CN, that means setting up new supply chains for electric vehicles, transporting critical minerals necessary for batteries from mines to refineries, from refineries to factories, and eventually electrified cars from factories to consumers. It means moving liquid natural gas and timber out of northern BC to markets here and abroad. It means extending CN's reach beyond Canada and the US deep into Mexico. And it means spending money on new trains, technology, and infrastructure, several $billions a year. It's an aggressive growth agenda, but there's a worrying obstacle: new federal legislation that will impose expensive, anti-competitive new rules on shipping cargo. Railways will be forced to operate with one foot on the gas and the other on the brake. CN wants to create and expand supply chains. The federal government appears to have something else in mind. Elly, can we go back to Bill's initial point? Is CBC News good at what it does right now?
Not as good as it used to be. But then again, very few people are. The fragmentation of audience, the ruthless kind of struggle for survival, has forced everybody to look over their shoulder and see what people are watching and not watching, and try to cater to consumer tastes. And generally, journalism over the years has gone downscale as it tries to assemble constituencies of audience in order to build critical mass. There's no mystery to it. So even if it chose to be more excellent or focus on more issues of relevance, it can't do it in a competitive environment. That goes to Bill's point. If you got the CBC out of advertising, you would get rid of a lot of the reason, not all of the reason, but a lot of the reason for its editorial operations now, and the scope of them, scale of them. But there's also the pride that every organization has in being competitive, whether it's assembling ad dollars or not. Mm-hmm. So the CBC will always look over its shoulder at its consumer base and its audience base. There's no point having a 4% audience share and being proud of your journalism. It's always been a balance between things you have to do and things you want to journalism that then appeal to an audience in order to build the level of that audience. Having said that, I hear Bill's point, and you hear it a lot, that with an audience share that they have currently, they have lost their relevance as an organization. I'm not going to dispute that. I think that their original mission clearly implied a greater connection to people than they currently have, at least on English television. But that's not the point that I'm particularly concerned about now. That presumably is fixable. It's fixable with the right motivation, getting them out of advertising, changing their mandate, making them truly a public broadcaster,
What does that mean? In what way are they not now?
Well, I think their commercial impulses govern their editorial choices.
Oh, okay. All right.
But I think all of that is fixable under the right hands. The issue for me is what happens to the larger journalistic enterprise in Canada, absent a national journalistic organization like this. We can all agree that it's somewhat lost its way. The question is, does that mean that you allow it to fall off the cliff? Or do you accept that there is a public policy reason to maintain a national broadcaster or a national journalist in this country, given our centrifugal forces, our alienation of the regions from the center, the need for a common shared agenda of information, the need for common journalism, is what we're seeing a inevitable or inherent failure of the model, or simply an organization that has lost its way and needs to be redirected? I believe it's the second, not the first. I may be whistling past the graveyard. I'm concerned a little bit about the digital issue. I'm not sure that there is a sufficient way to monetize a digital presence at the level that it currently exists at the CBC. What you didn't say, David, and probably should have, is it's got the largest digital audience in the country, journalistically, far and away, dwarfs any other competitor in that space. And that's because it feeds, all of its journalists feed into that platform. It's got real reach.
It is my first and primary source of research for these programs of all of the Canadian journalistic sources, because it will have the most articles and most content on any subject I'm looking for almost.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. But monetizing that is the real dilemma. Can the CBC, whatever the CBC spends on journalism, and it's hundreds of millions of dollars a year, can that be recovered through a journalistic a digital platform? Nobody has made that work yet.
No, but I just want to pick up, when you made the reference to Pierre Poilievre earlier, this is not the first time a political leader has taken issue with the CBC. I mean, I'm old enough to remember previous governments of a liberal persuasion being absolutely convinced that Radio-Canada was a hotbed of separatists and were very vocal in their criticism of Radio-Canada. And I think that kind of thing is inevitable when the news, quote unquote, is defined a certain way. And this is a bit of a hobby horse of mine, so I apologize for that in advance. But news by definition is, as currently defined, let me put it that way, is kind of what's different today about yesterday, and too often it's what went wrong, right? So inherently there's a kind of an anti-government bias, not because of a philosophy, not because of a political bias, just because they tend to highlight what didn't work as opposed to what did. And one of the ways that I think the CBC would help itself is if it embraced more enthusiastically the idea of it as the place for the community conversation writ large. I don't want to get theoretical, but the historical transmission model of one-to-many news by way of a measure of control, given way to kind of collective conversations. Now, the CBC backers are all going to be on the phone right now saying, "Oh, we do lots of that, and that's why we have news and current affairs. And don't you turn on the radio in the morning?" And okay, fine. But we're not doing a very good job of that, right? We're not having a good collective conversation in this country at present. And you could argue we're not having very good collective conversations in Western liberal democracies writ large. And you would have to acknowledge that there's significant debate about public broadcasting in every one of those Western liberal democracies. But to me, that's the raison d'etre of a public broadcaster. And let me give you a very specific example. Okay. Guns. Okay. The Montreal Massacre was in the 1990s. We are still debating gun legislation. So whatever we've been doing as a public discourse around that issue has not worked. Right? Demonstrably, it has not worked. So the news tendency to kind of saying, oh no, we did that yesterday, we can't do it again today. My argument would be keep doing it today and do it tomorrow and do it next week till we come to a more collective understanding, which I would argue is a precondition to a collective resolution.
I'll take that, Bill, but if you gave me a second chance to sell that gun registry, I'd do a better job of it this time.
No, but I cite it like, I live in downtown Toronto, right? So people in Toronto think, well, why would anybody have a gun?
Yeah.
And if they had a gun, why would they ever have two? But I was born and raised in a town in Northern Ontario called Timmins, where people hunt for their freezer, not for fun. And up there, they would wonder, what in hell was wrong with you if you thought you went hunting for a moose with the same gun you went hunting for a partridge, right? So it's not like there's lots of conversation to be had here.
Okay.
And my argument would be the public broadcaster needs to expand that.
So you dismissed political bias, but I want to take this head on with you two, because it seems to me to be really core to the small c and large c conservative antagonism toward the CBC. I'll start by saying that back in the 90s, when nightly news programs still had large audiences, and I would poll people, sometimes I would ask them what nightly news show they watched. And if you cross-tab that with voting intention, you would see that people were sorting themselves out, that conservative voters tended to watch the CTV or Global News, and the Liberal and NDP voters tended to watch the CBC News. They had all seen something in these news programs that sorted them out that way. And in your article, Elly, you talked about the CBC having a culture of progressive, urban progressive attitudes that acted as somewhat of a counterweight to conservative sentiment in the country. Why is that the purpose of a public broadcaster? Why would public money go into something that reflected a particular mindset?
I don't think it should. I'm not defending that proposition. Excuse me. But the reality is, let me explain the context in which it operates from my perspective, having worked there for better part of a quarter century. The general drift of media in the country tends to the conservative side of the spectrum. Not deeply conservative, not Trump conservative, but business-oriented, suburban-oriented. You take the national organizations that we currently have, the Globe Mail, the National Post, to a lesser extent, the two television networks, Global and CTV. But nevertheless, they speak from the center to center right of the spectrum. Let me make that proposition. I think that the CBC traditionally, has seen a bit of a vacuum in what it should be, in balancing off the general coverage. It has seen itself as a counterweight, somewhat, to the general right-wing tendency of other media or journalistic organizations in the country. It has been captured, I think, by the general trend among progressives to make the point that national media generally around the world tend to avoid marginalized people, tend to be majoritarian, tend to be business focused. And I think that the social movements around diversity and inclusion have begun to make the case to journalists. They haven't begun. They've made the case to journalists that if you don't represent your audience, actually physically represent your audience, you don't have visible minorities, you don't have women, you don't have gender minorities, and they're not visible, then you are not, as an organization, a journalistic organization, representing them, because they're not seeing themselves reflected in what you're broadcasting. So as these organizations move, or the CBC particularly, moves towards more diversity and inclusion, it brings with it journalists who kind of advance those agendas within the organization. And you get general momentum, which is quite obvious in the CBC, that begins to focus more than others on Indigenous issues, diversity issues, inclusion issues, a lot of which are urban, and where a lot of people are marginalized in urban centers. And it all becomes one dynamic that begins to shift their editorial focus.
But Elly, at the end of the day, I mean, the problem to me seems to be that the CBC very clearly has a social justice agenda in its news coverage, and it feels like the same agenda that the government has. So I can see how a conservative might say these two organizations are working together to promote the same view of the world.
I'm not arguing against that. I'm trying to explain the context for
Yeah.
Look, I think it is part of the current reality is a lot of centrist Canadians and conservative Canadians don't see themselves reflected in the CBC anymore.
Yeah. I think that's a critically important point that Elly's just made. The public broadcaster must reflect the public it purports to serve. And for too many people, they don't think that's the case. And I think there's actually a unique opportunity at the CBC right now. And I'm going to just skate out on some very, very thin ice here. And I'm going to preface it by saying I concede that there's a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I'm going to preface it by saying, ageism is a factor, and that old guys like me, we have a right to keep working. I'm going to just declare all that. But the fact of the matter is, a significant percentage of the working population at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and Société Radio-Canada are individuals who have earned and are entitled to fully indexed pensions. And the CBC should encourage those people to exercise the right that they've earned, and they should use that to pursue their inclusion process, because by definition, if you've got reduced numbers and you've got an inclusion agenda, it's just math. Almost all of the openings have to go to a particular segment of your population. And that just compounds the feeling that some people will have that they feel excluded. But if you took that big number, you'd create a lot more opportunities, and you'd get the kind of inclusion that Elly was talking about. The CBC is uniquely positioned, with its northern service, and it ought not to be captive to downtown Toronto. It's better positioned, I would argue, than any other news organization for that not to be the case. And if the resource was to take advantage of these new openings that I'm talking about, literally getting people who are eligible to retire, I think you could fundamentally change the kind of the population of the CBC, and in doing so would fundamentally change the offering of the CBC in a way that would be productive and constructive.
Right. But if I'm coming at it from the perspective of, I feel that it's by far the biggest, serious, credible news organization left. It's covering more stuff than anybody else is. We can't lose that coverage. That does then demand a sort of neutrality out of that organization, doesn't it? That perhaps it doesn't show right now.
Well, neutrality, if the measure is the traditional transmission model of news that we now operate in. But if you felt that you were that your view was being represented somehow on the programming that the CBC was offering, then you'd be less preoccupied with what you see as a bias. And look, I'm not trying to tiptoe around. I mean, the CBC made two decisions that absolutely compounded the problem the perception problem it has in conservative circles. The first was their president has no business getting in an argument with the leader of the opposition in a public way. That's not the president's job. And if the opposition criticizing the CBC is absolutely fair.
It's not allowed to have any will to live itself, the CBC? It can't fight for itself?
It can't not. It's got a minister to do that. You're the head of a crown corporation. Tend to your own knitting. Connect to your public. Like I say, the thing that I find so challenging is this. There's a tendency on the part of the leadership of the CBC to think their only problems are political, and then within the political context, their only problems are with one party. That's demonstrably not true. Their problems are with their public. So the president should focus on their public. For the CBC to file a lawsuit around the use of some film footage and then name two of their Ottawa correspondents as the people bringing that lawsuit does them a tremendous disservice. You remember the kerfuffle about the election ads, and they actually named Rosemary Barton and John Paul Tasker in that suit. Now, a very few days later, they realized what a colossal blunder that was, and withdrew the names of those two individuals. But if you're on Twitter, Rosemary Barton is still paying a price for that leadership failure. And so, stick to your knitting. Get people interested in your program, and let Pablo Rodriguez defend the idea of a public broadcaster. Let your product speak for yourself.
You'd think that in 2023, governments across the country would have legislative frameworks in place that offer real benefits and real protections for workers in the gig economy. Well, you'd be wrong. Legislative inaction has led to an historic moment here in Canada because it's not often that you find labor and industry coming together. But that's the case for our sponsor Uber and their collaboration with the United Food and Commercial Workers of Canada. Tired of the status quo, and after listening to what workers really want, Uber and UFCW Canada signed a landmark agreement in 2022, creating a first-of-its-kind made-in-Canada representation model that guarantees representation and benefits for over 100,000 earners on the Uber platform. Since then, over 750 drivers and delivery people requested and had access to representation when they needed it the most. What may have the biggest impact, however, will be what this agreement could potentially deliver through changes in the law. With feedback from drivers and delivery people, the partners developed a legislative standards package advocating for a minimum earning standard and a benefits fund for workers while guaranteeing their right to a notice of termination, representation, and health and safety protections on the job. It's only right to build on those standards and make progress for working people. Today, Uber and UFCW Canada have stayed true to their word on joint advocacy efforts, holding meetings and consultations with ministers of labour and their teams across the country. In a quintessential Canadian manner of coming together and getting things done, Uber and UFCW Canada are making it right for app-based workers across the country. Learn more at uber.com/UFCW Canada. Elly, you ran that shop. What should they do over the next 2 years instead of yelling at Pierre Poilievre publicly? What should they be doing to buttress their position?
Boy, I wish I had an answer to that. I guess my point, David, if I can sidestep your question just a little bit, is that until governments and political parties accept that there's a public policy reason for there to be a public broadcaster, and they accept that they're going to be carrying it for a while until the ship is righted, we're going to run out of track on this particular issue. I take Mr. Poilievre at face value and seriously. I think that he is going to do what he says. That, you know, so that puts us on a time frame, you know, of who knows what, 12 months, 24 months, not very long. Turning around the culture at the CBC in the way Bill is suggesting, and maybe the way I'm suggesting, is a longer term proposition. It can't be done overnight. You can't go in, you know, with a social architecture lens and say to the newsroom, thou shalt run the following stories to protect yourself, you know, as you go forward. That's an impossible way to run a journalistic operation. You know, there's going to be a leadership change at the CBC, obviously. The current president's mandate is running out, and there's little chance she'll be renewed. The government of the day will likely have the opportunity to appoint a new president. There are board vacancies that will come open. I think that if government treats this as a long-term public policy problem to be fixed, the CBC will have a chance. So I can't answer your question. What can they do over the next 12 to 24 months? There's almost nothing they can do that will reverse what has been building over a decade or two within the organization. But I think collectively, as a country, if we accept that we're going to live with some of the shortfalls the CBC currently faces, some of the gaps that it has created by its reduced focus. If we just accept that we've got a bit of a broken system, but we need the system, then I think over time we can get there. But if your question is what can we do in the next 18 months, precious little in my view, because I think that the politics of this have set in pretty deeply. And unless we have I agree with Bill. The problem is not essentially political. The politicians are reacting to what their bases and their voters are telling them. But if the politicians don't lead on this, then we'll lose the CBC, I think, in the next Conservative government. If Mr. Poilievre and his colleagues, accept the need to have this kind of discussion around the CBC and its future, and a more nuanced discussion, then we have a chance. But we can't do it on the basis of what's going to be on the National tonight.
Just to pick up on that, David, I do not for 1 second question whether Mr. Poilievre absolutely and emphatically believes in what he is saying. Given. But as is often the case with people who lead opposition parties, when it gets to governments, he may find out that the dismantling of the CBC funding may be a little more complex than he maybe appreciates today, and that may not be where he'd want to start. But let's just say he wants to do that. Then I would argue that is our opportunity to have a genuine conversation about whether or not we as a nation think a public broadcaster is of value. Now, I have a bias on that. If it was legitimate 100 years ago, almost, to have a debate because of the challenge posed by, U.S. radio, it's equally legitimate to have that discussion today in the context of a digital world and an online world. And if we want to have voice as a country, If we want to see ourselves as a country rather than a market, then we need to have that conversation. And I would argue the CBC, Radio-Canada, is the platform for us to be able to express as a country rather than as a market. Because, one of the challenge, and I have lots of sympathy for programmers at the CBC. There are a lot of challenges there because we as a country haven't figured out whether we've got industrial policy or cultural policy. If you talk to a Canadian independent producer today, they're all going to chuckle and say they spend half their lives up in Sudbury. Why? Because there's incentives for people to go up and shoot stuff up there. That's industrial policy, and it works. Okay, it works, and there's jobs for people, and it all works. But if we want voice, that's something different. Not to disparage Amazing Race Canada in any way, shape, or form, but that's not about voice. If we want to have voice, then we got to have cultural policy. If we're going to have cultural policy, we got to protect intellectual property. That's directors. That's Canadian production companies. That's writers. That's not, the industrial side of the business. We should have that discussion. And I'd be pretty confident about where that would net out if it was a genuine conversation, as opposed to, I hate this news story, therefore I hate this network, therefore we're going to shut it down.
If I can comment a bit, though, on what Bill just said, I personally make it a differentiation of some sort between the programming side, the entertainment programming side, and the journalistic side. I'm more open to the notion that you can get Canadian content developed through industrial policy on the programming side, the entertainment side. And you can do it through regulation, Fiat, CRTC regs, Canadian content regs. I'm not, and the CBC doesn't do any in-house production anymore, or very little of it.
Right.
So I'm less concerned about that than I am about the journalism side. But I accept the proposition that part of the CBC's face to the country is its Canadian entertainment programming, and the diminished audience share for that is allowing the larger argument about the irrelevancy of the CBC to dominate the conversation and intrude on the journalistic operation, which I think is different.
So are the two inextricably linked, or are they severable? Let's say nobody cares about CBC Entertainment Division anymore. Could CBC News, as we know it now, exist as a standalone, say, the news network, just no broadcast enterprise that does entertainment, just singularly as a news network, but not the current news network, but the news network with all the resources that CBC News currently has?
Really complicated question. It's a question of back office operations, buildings, critical mass technically, how resources are shared between entertainment and journalism, if at all. We're still in flux about delivery platforms. Is cable or digital distribution of things like CBC News Network, which inherently gets less audience than the main television network, still caught up in that flux where people still turn to TV, whether it's CTV, Global, CBC, for major events. They don't turn to digital or cable for the transmission of those things. So we're in a transition period. Does the CBC bureaucracy and physical plant, which now nurtures all of its networks, radio, Northern, Indigenous, Radio-Canada, English television, entertainment, how much of each of those is severable? To Bill's point, Mr. Poilievre's going to find out, I guess, as he moves forward in implementation, just how complicated that is. And whether you can lop off the arm and not create damage to the rest of the body is going to be an interesting question. So you're posing a question, David, that I don't have the answer to. But I do know that, to me, the public policy on the entertainment side is much easier to protect through regulation than the public policy on the journalistic side.
Yeah, see, I don't have the answer either, but I would argue that they're linked. Look, most of us in Canada live, driver 9-iron from the country that produces more cultural content than any place else in the world. That is not an insignificant challenge, right? So what are the two elements that allow us to have unique voice against that cultural challenge? If I was a political economist, I'd say cultural imperialism.
Yeah, sure.
One of them is news and current affairs, okay? The US Nets are not going to come and cover Canada to the extent that the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and others, CTV, Global, everybody else, can cover it. So that's opportunity number one. But to me, it's linked to opportunity number two, which is you got to tell Canadian stories, and they have to be a Canadian voice. And if news sort of starts to do the migration that I'm advocating for, to get away from the world of said yesterday, to get away from the world of hard news, quote unquote, it gets into more truth and cumulative truth. To me, they go hand in hand. And I don't take issue with Elly at all on industrial policy has had its successes, but at the end of the day, if the person that controls the pen is not Canadian, then the Canadian story will not be told. And if the Canadian story is not being told, I'm not sure why we need a public broadcaster then. So in my mind, they are inextricably linked.
Okay. Hey, Bill, just stick with you for a sec. What does RadCan do well that CBC English doesn't do? And does it have to do with news or entertainment? And does it have to do with Quebec or RadCan?
Well, I think a number of things. First of all, the cultural pressures I just referenced are not as pronounced in Quebec because they're dealing in a different language, first of all. So they don't have to worry about the blockbuster series that NBC or CBS or more likely a streaming service has produced at staggering expense. I mean, how's the CBC supposed to compete against Netflix if Netflix throws a bunch of money into something?
French people don't watch Ted Lasso?
They do, but culturally they're looking for their own things. So it isn't just news and current affairs. Although current affairs, they have a Sunday night public affairs show that is as must-see as things used to be on the English network, in fairness. I mean, when Elly and I were in the gallery together, and then later when I was in the Prime Minister's office, that's a better illustration. Whatever we were doing in the course of the day, I can tell you what we were doing at 10 o'clock at night. We were watching the newscasts that Elly and his team were contributing news items to. And there was no question about what, and now we were, flicking back and forth between English and French. And
that's where question period prep started.
But it was,
it started with the CBC News. Right.
The cliche about must-see TV, that was must-see TV. And it bled into the CTV News at 11. And, so I'm not sure that's the case anymore. But to me, that's where you got to get back to. But my argument is, but you're not going to get back to that if you're using the same stuff you were using 30 years ago. I mean, people talk about CBC radio, right, and how successful it is, and I'm not arguing any of that. But I chuckle, because what's one of the flagship shows on CBC radio, right? As It Happens, right? Has been for years. Well, As It Happens, 50 years old. So what's the current? What's the equivalent? I mean, Mark Starwitz, that was a stroke of of genius when he created As It Happens. He understood there was a technology, i.e. landlines, and people answered the phone. And you could get to prominent people with a direct call. And because it was TV, you didn't need images, and you could be right on top of the news instantly. Well, what's the equivalent of that today? And that's the challenge to the people within the CBC. And I know they're doing lots of great stuff in digital, and their streaming service has been successful. But they need to make the public more aware of all of the services that they can and all the potential that they have, instead of picking fights with opposition leaders, which are just go nowhere. It's just a waste of everybody's time.
Elly, how meaningful are the subsidies the government is providing to other journalism organizations? And if the government got out of the CBC, is there a role for government in supporting the journalistic ecosystem that is disappearing in front of our eyes?
Oh, absolutely. Look, a country, a society, a culture doesn't survive without common information and a common agenda. If we all live in atomized units, turning into closed loops of information that just tell us what we want to know, and appeal to our base instincts, then collectively as citizens, we'll lose sight of the decisions that have to be made, the resources that have to be allocated, the triage that have to be done on a public policy level. It's a pretty obvious proposition. If the CBC disappears, then and the business case against traditional media continues to, there is no other organization that can step in or force that can step in other than government. And if government doesn't understand its self-interest in supporting the distribution of common information throughout the polity that it governs, it's on a prescription for failure or autocracy. Let's not beat around the bush. A democracy requires diversity of voices, diversity of information, and a way for people to understand the common set of problems, the hierarchy of importance, and politics is all about affecting that hierarchy and affecting the triage of resources, because there's never enough resources. So politics is about governments allocating resources. If you don't understand what the problems are, if you don't get information about potential solutions or options, then you lose your ability as a citizen to affect the way you're governed. This sounds like poli-sci 101, but it's fundamental. And journalism is one of the very few threads that binds democratic societies together, particularly in circumstances where you have disparate cultures, multi-partisanship. We see what's happening in the U.S., where they are losing the ability to have a national conversation. They don't have national organizations journalistically. The audience shares to the major networks are dwindling to nothing. There are 3 major national newspapers in the United States with a population of 300 million people that hardly don't cover it. They are a society that's lost its way. They don't have the same conversation as a country anymore. They have a series of red and blue conversations at the very best. If we want to avoid that, then we've got to make sure that the journalists are telling Canadians what they need to know, not what they want to know, what they need to know on a daily basis. And if we are losing those journalist organizations and government doesn't step in to support them, I don't know where it goes other than where it went in the U.S.
It feels like there's more and more opinion, of which this show is an example, but more and more opinion based on less and less reporting.
Yeah, and historically, one of the things that critics have been very sharp is on that very point, that there's there are too many people writing on stories that they haven't reported on, and that 90% of the content is derivative. And we need to move away from that. But, let me be deliberately provocative. If a politician of any stripe wants to reflect on why they should engage in a conversation around the need for a public broadcaster and or journalism writ large, how about their own naked self-interest? Because if we're not a country anymore, if we're just a market, then markets can get carved up differently. And if we're just a market, then maybe we don't need some of the institutions that we have. And maybe the political alignments change. And maybe the structures of government change. So it's in everybody's interest to continue a conversation of Canada as a country. And the irony is, we have direct experience of what happens when those conversations get fragmented and get carried on independently. And in our case, it was divided on language. But we had 2 referendums in this country. This is not an abstract thing for us, right? The future gets debated.
Yeah, very much so.
So we ought not to be kind of, assuming that it the same kind of thing won't happen again in a different construct than language and independence.
Elly, just as an aside, are you hard up against it, or do I have time for 2 more questions?
I'm fine.
Okay, cool. So just to stick with my opinion question for a second, let me put a proposition to you about what the CBC could do over the next 18 to 24 months, which is to go back to, I think, what its policy used to be and tell its journalists that they no longer have opinions publicly.
Well, sure. I'm trying to process that. I just don't know how fundamental an issue or a problem that is. In my day, we had a policy book where reporter was not allowed to express opinion. I remember we had every Sunday night, we had a horribly awkward problem where David Halton, who was the chief political correspondent, and Jeff
would have to look inferior to Jeff Simpson, because Jeff could say all kinds of things and David would just have to sit there. Yeah.
Every Monday morning, David, would have his bosses, say, you ventured into opinion. Look, I think that's a real issue in terms of, you can't be a reporter. Take Bob Fife, okay? He's a reporter for the Globe and Mail, reporting on very sensitive material, doing it, trying to do it fairly and objectively, or at least, presenting both sides of the issue. And then he goes on Twitter and retweets or expresses his own opinion, or goes on a panel and becomes a pundit as opposed to a reporter. And
starts questioning motivation and things like that lead people to conclude you're a partisan.
Yes.
Right.
So it would be helpful. I don't think, frankly, as I go through the CBC roster that I know, or the programming that I know, that there is as much of that at the CBC as there may be elsewhere. I think they're reasonably careful, even on News Network, but they do put their reporters on panels that are expressing opinion, and the reporters are challenged not to. So sure, if reporters stayed away from opinion, there'd be less chances of them creating political waves. But remember, the line between opinion and conclusion, informed conclusion, is sometimes really hard to discern. Mm-hmm. So a reporter who has done the research, weighed the evidence, is actually supposed to come to a conclusion. It's supposed to say on balance.
Yeah, fair enough. But I watch these panels on Sunday morning, and it's just 4 journalists sitting around running their mouths like Scott Reed, Corey Tenike, and Jordan Leichnitz do on the Curse of Politics. It's not informed any more than ours is informed. It's just judgments.
No, I agree with that, and I think that the advent of cable television has prized that, because there's no other way to fill it. And it's become norm. I don't think it's helpful. Yeah. I don't think it's healthy. I agree. But I'm sure it's a solution.
And David, it's a problem inherent in a social media era. and it's not unique to the CBC. I mean, part of the legendary editor, Marty Barron at the Washington Post, part of his struggle with the Washington Post staff was literally over who gets to say what on Twitter. So you can, on the one hand, be telling people that, you want the brand out there, and then on the other say, but we're going to attempt to circumscribe what it is you have to say. I want to pick up, though, on Elly's point that I think is critically important. Journalists often talk about closed loops of information. But if you follow certain social media patterns, and I'll just use Twitter as an illustrative, there probably are no worse offenders of closed loop circulation than political journalists who retweet every column that agrees with their worldview and studiously ignore everybody that takes issue with them.
Bill, on the role of government, you had thoughts on this in your book, and you proposed a tax-based system for funding journalism in the book. Did you think that would be sufficient to create a robust enough ecosystem that we wouldn't need a CBC necessarily?
No, I didn't see it in the context of the CBC because I believe fundamentally that Canada must have a public broadcaster. Like, that's, as far as I'm concerned, that is an element of our citizenship that we need to cherish. Now, having said I support a public broadcaster, that's not necessarily to say I completely support the CBC as presently constituted. In my mind, those are two different things. Yeah. The reason why I was advocating something as simple as kind of tax deductions is I don't like the idea of committees. I don't like the idea of people, determining whose journalism is acceptable and whose isn't. I don't like it when it's applied to the CBC. I don't like it when it's applied to the Globe and Mail. I don't like it when it's applied to the Rebel, frankly. And so what I was advocating is, why don't you have something that meets the classical, 17th century liberal test of universality, that's ameliorative. And so my notion was, encourage people to support news organizations by giving them tax credits in the same way that we allow people to make contributions to political parties. And part of the pushback was, well, I don't know that the number is enough to make a difference. And so raise the number, like make it meaningful. So that if I subscribe to a number of Canadian news organizations, I was going to, you can't even say newspaper anymore because there's no paper, but, however that works, I should be allowed to deduct it up to limits that are similar to what I can contribute politically. And I think that's a better base because, one of the things... I got to
tell you, Bill, just to interrupt you for a second, I got to tell you, I went off Twitter and I've started looking for other sources of things to read. And I discovered Substack and all kinds of things, right? And various other services. And you start subscribing to them. It fucking adds up. Quickly.
Because you kind of read a piece and then you think, oh, well, that's interesting,
Yeah.
And so you click on, and you don't think about it, except, at the end of the month, you've clicked on to 9 new things.
Exactly.
But to come back to my point, I think that's still a better system where it's, there's no bureaucracy involved. It's just CRA, and, you send in your receipt the same way you would for a political donation, and you get a credit or you don't. And then that respect, because I am still a free markets guy, that respects the imperative of the market. So, bigger organizations are going to benefit more. But, and it's, the reason it's got to be universal, like, as a standalone proposition, do I think the taxpayers of Canada should send any money to a newspaper that's owned by somebody whose title is 3rd Baron Thompson of Fleet Street or whatever it is? No. but in my mind, it's got to be universal. So the Globe and Mail has to be as eligible for it as anybody else. And I was struck by the irony that, all these newspaper publishers were up, spent years in Ottawa lobbying to get, the money. And now they're all kind of busy telling us it's not that significant to their bottom line. So why did we give it to them in the first place, I guess?
Well, I guess the question is, would they be existing at all? Could the Toronto Star even exist at all without that funding?
Well, I think, it's not clear anybody exists anyway. As Elly says, they're disappearing. News deserts are not just a concept anymore. They're a reality. But, and there's no question that they have to find a different business model now. But inherent in the different business model, if you're going to make me pay for it, then you got to up your game. And your product has to be worth my spending money. And too often, the product on offer doesn't meet the test of the market. And it's irritating, look, if I had this answer, I wouldn't be retired. But, there's got to be some kind of micro payment system. God, you can't buy a coffee without an iPhone today.
Soon we'll be tipping journalists.
Yeah. Start at 20%, like all the restaurants in Toronto, and go up from there. But no, the advertising is gone and it's never coming back, and everybody needs to get their head around that. So you got to have a different business model for sure.
And
all right, go ahead, Elly. Yeah, please.
The Brits are less shy about how they intervene in this marketplace. For instance, the BBC, funds local reporters who work for local media organizations and not the BBC. The BBC is used as a distribution system for subsidization of local journalism all through the UK. There are ways of looking at this. Now, we run into the obstacle of journalists refusing to accept public money because they think that it somehow compromises them, right? Now, it's generally journalists who work for the biggest organizations who say that, whose job is secure. But we'll set that aside. I think we have to overcome that problem. I think that if journalists rely only on market forces to keep them viable, we've seen the result of that. Here in the U.S. So it is it's a market failure of some sort. And in times of market failure, governments step in.
Right.
They do everywhere else.
Elly, can I conclude this with asking you for a piece of advice? So I'm going to, in the election campaign, whenever it happens, 18 or 24 months, I'm going to run into a voter who is going to say to me, I don't watch CBC, and as far as I know, I don't consume any of their product. Why should I support it? What is the best answer to that question?
It depends on how healthy that person is. Let's take that person. Let's say that person who says it is 24 years old. I mean, your answer to that is you pay for a health system which you're not currently using.
Right.
But the health system is a public good. You pay for public transportation, but you have a car. But public transportation is a public good. The point is that national journalism is a public good and an important public good. And without it, countries have difficulty in surviving. You don't have to consume it to understand its importance. There's lots of things government do that I have nothing to do with, and I don't get any personal benefit from. But I accept that there's a larger public good the government is assigned to deal with. Is it worth the 33 cents a day or whatever the CBC costs every Canadian to have a national broadcaster? In my view, yes. It's prophylactic. It keeps your country and your democracy together. It doesn't do it by itself. CTV does it and Global does it. But the reality is the Globe and Mail doesn't, because the Globe and Mail is not available all through the country except online, right? people have to understand governments distribute resources and money based on public requirements. And in my view, the argument to that person is national broadcaster is a public requirement.
Cool. Bill, anything to add to that?
Yeah, to me, my argument would be one word: citizenship. You know, you're either a citizen, you either believe in the country, you either believe in the entity, or you don't.
Awesome. I could talk to you guys all day about this and a million other things, but I think for our listeners' sake, in terms of time, we should wrap it up. So I just blown away by you guys. Thank you so much for doing this. What a great conversation this was. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsors, CN Rail and Uber Canada, and all of you folks who watched or listened. What a treat it was to have Bill and Elly with us. Thanks so much, and we'll be back next week with more Herle Burly.
Take care.
Thank you, David. Good to see you, Elly.
Good to see you, Bill. Regards to Bonnie.
Yeah.